We moved to the cabin in the early spring, when the air still had a bite to it and the ground was half frozen from the long winter. There was a freshness to the air that felt like hope. We'd been looking for a way to start over, to leave behind the noise and bustle of Stockholm and find some peace. The idea of moving to the countryside seemed perfect at the time. A place where the silence wouldn't feel so suffocating, where the world would slow down enough for us to breathe again. The cabin sat deep in the forest, far enough from the nearest village that you couldn't see another house for miles. It was an old building, built generations ago, its wooden frame creaking and weathered, with a roof that sloped unevenly under the weight of the seasons. The land stretched out around it, a dense blanket of trees, their thick trunks twisting together like ancient sentinels guarding something secret. To me, it was exactly what I needed, a place to escape, to get away from the stress of the city, the never-ending noise. Out here, the loudest thing was the wind rustling through the pines, the occasional snap of a branch in the underbrush, or the distant cry of an animal. For the first time in years, I could think, I could breathe. For Helena, though, it was different. She tried to hide it, but I could see it in her eyes from the moment we arrived. The cabin was too isolated for her, the silence too deep. She had always been more connected to people, and the thought of being so far from civilization unnerved her. Still, she said nothing, just smiled when I asked if she liked it. We both knew why we had come here, to fix things, to give our marriage the space to heal, away from the pressure of work, the distractions of the city. I spent the first few days fixing things around the cabin. The roof needed patching, the stovepipe was cracked, and the porch had seen better days. It was the kind of work that felt good, the kind that took your mind off everything else. Helena unpacked, busied herself with the garden out back, and tried to settle into this new rhythm of life. At night, we'd sit on the porch with mugs of coffee, listening to the forest, wrapped in blankets to fight off the lingering chill. At first, the stillness of the place was calming. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional owl calling from the trees. But as the days wore on, something about that quiet began to feel different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the silence itself was pressing in on us. The first time we heard it, it was faint. We were sitting by the fire one evening, the sun having just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a pale purple. The woods around us had settled into that deep, quiet stillness that comes with twilight. That's when we heard the sound, a soft, distant cry, almost like a child's voice drifting through the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal, a fox, or some other creature making a noise that just happened to sound like a cry. I glanced at Helena, and she looked back at me with a puzzled expression. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might invite the sound closer. I nodded. "Probably just the wind or something," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. But the unease had already settled in. It hadn't sounded like the wind. It hadn't sounded like an animal either. There had been something about the tone of it, something too human. The cry came again, a little louder this time, like it was moving through the trees toward us. My skin prickled, and I stood up, stepping off the porch to peer into the forest. But all I saw were shadows stretching between the trees, the last traces of daylight filtering through the branches. "Maybe it's a lost child," Helena said, though there was a note of doubt in her voice. "A lost child? Out here, in the middle of nowhere?" It didn't seem possible. We waited, listening, but after a few minutes, the sound stopped. The forest returned to its eerie quiet, and we didn't hear the cry again that night. Still, it lingered in my mind long after we went to bed. I found myself lying awake, listening for it, expecting it to return. But the night passed in silence. In the morning, the forest was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it had been nothing, a trick of the wind maybe, or just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And whatever it was, I had the distinct feeling that it wasn't going to go away. The next few nights passed in uneasy silence, the kind where every creak and rustle takes on an unnatural weight. We didn't hear the cry again, and I almost convinced myself it had been a one-off, a trick of the mind or some animal passing through. But there was a tension in the air now, something just beneath the surface that neither of us could name. Helena seemed particularly unsettled. I'd catch her staring out the window toward the woods, her brow furrowed, as if she were waiting for something to appear. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. I felt it too. It wasn't just the sound that haunted me, it was the way it felt, as though the forest had shifted somehow, as if we were no longer alone. Then, on the fourth night, we heard it again. It was late, past midnight. I had fallen asleep on the couch after a long day of clearing out the brush behind the cabin. Helena was already in bed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim, flickering light across the room. The house was quiet except for the soft crackle of the dying fire, the kind of quiet that had become normal out here. But then it came, a faint, high-pitched cry drifting through the trees, like a child's voice calling out in the night. This time there was no mistaking it. My heart jumped in my chest and I sat up, the blanket slipping off my lap. The sound was the same as before, soft, distant, but undeniably human. And this time it sent a cold shiver down my spine that I couldn't shake. I stood up slowly, trying not to disturb the quiet, and walked to the window. Outside, the moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. The woods loomed dark and impenetrable beyond the clearing, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I strained to see something, anything between the trunks, but the forest was a wall of black. Then I heard it again. Louder. Closer. Did you hear that? Helena's voice startled me. I hadn't realized she was awake. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her arms crossed over her chest, her face pale. She looked at me with wide eyes, as if she already knew the answer. "Yeah," I said, my voice low, not wanting to break the fragile stillness. "It's the same as before." She nodded, and we both stood there, listening. The cry came again, this time unmistakably closer. It sounded like it was coming from the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards away. It was a child's voice, thin, fragile, and full of desperation. A sound that made your gut twist with fear, the kind of sound that demanded you do something, anything to stop it. Helena's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What if it's someone's kid?" she whispered. "Maybe someone got lost in the woods?" I shook my head, though I couldn't come up with a better explanation. "We're miles from the nearest house," I said, glancing back at the dark line of trees. "Who would be out here this late?" The cry came again, sharper this time, and I saw Helena flinch. "We have to check," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't just ignore it." I didn't argue. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and opened the front door, the cool night air rushing in. Helena followed close behind, wrapping a coat around her shoulders. The yard was eerily quiet except for the wind rustling the trees, but the sound of the crying still hung in the air, tugging at me, pulling me toward the woods. We crossed the yard slowly, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness in thin, shaky arcs. I could feel Helena's tension, her breath coming in short, quick bursts as we neared the edge of the forest. The crying was closer now, just beyond the first line of trees, echoing through the underbrush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange and small in the vast darkness. Is someone out there? No response, just the steady rhythm of the crying. We stepped into the woods, the flashlight flickering as it cut through the thick shadows. The trees closed in around us, the air growing colder. The crying was louder now, but somehow it seemed to be moving, shifting deeper into the forest, as if it were leading us somewhere. "Wait," Helena said suddenly, grabbing my arm. "Something's wrong." I stopped, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. She was right. The crying wasn't just getting louder, it was changing. There was something off about it, something unnatural. It didn't sound like a child anymore. It was still high-pitched, still desperate, but now it had an edge to it. A kind of malice, like it was no longer pleading for help, but mocking us. We stood there in the dark, frozen in place, listening as the sound grew closer, sharper, until it was all around us, echoing off the trees. And for the first time, I realized it wasn't just crying. It was laughter. We stood there in the dark, our breaths hanging in the cold night air. The sound, that eerie, high-pitched wail that had started as a child's cry, now circled us, echoing through the trees. I gripped the flashlight tighter, but its beam did little to cut through the thick forest. The trees seemed to stretch closer, their branches clawing at the sky, and the sound. It was all around us, and it wasn't crying anymore. It was laughter. At first, it was soft, almost like the wind rustling through the branches. But as we stood frozen in the forest, the sound sharpened, turning into a cackling, malicious laughter that chilled me more than the cold ever could. I turned the flashlight in every direction, trying to locate the source, but the light seemed swallowed by the shadows. "This isn't right," Helena whispered, her voice trembling. I glanced at her and saw the fear in her eyes. She clutched her coat tightly around her, as if it would shield her from whatever was out there. She was right. Something wasn't right. The forest felt alive, as though it was watching us, and that laughter, it felt directed at us, mocking us, daring us to come closer. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and run, but something held me there. Curiosity, maybe, or some misplaced need to understand what was happening. "We need to go back," Helena said, pulling at my arm. "Now." I hesitated, the beam of the flashlight sweeping over the trees once more. The sound seemed to grow distant for a moment, like it was retreating deeper into the forest, pulling us with it. I took a step forward, and Helena's grip tightened. "No," she said firmly, her voice breaking. "I'm serious. We need to go back." There was a desperation in her voice that shook me out of my daze. I turned toward her, nodding slowly. "You're right. Let's get out of here." We turned and started making our way back toward the cabin, moving faster now, the flashlight bobbing in my hand. The laughter followed us, growing fainter as we distanced ourselves from the woods, but it never disappeared completely. It stayed on the edge of the trees, like it was waiting for us to make a mistake, to look back. By the time we reached the yard, the sound had faded into the night, but the unease it left behind clung to us. We hurried up the porch steps, slammed the door behind us, and locked it. Inside, the cabin felt unnervingly quiet, but at least we were safe, or so we thought. Helena paced the living room, her hands wringing together. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. It couldn't have been a child." I shook my head, still trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't think it was a person at all." Helena stopped pacing and looked at me, her face pale in the dim light. "Then what? What's out there?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that something in the forest was playing with us. Something old. Something that felt wrong in ways I couldn't explain. I thought about the laughter, how it had shifted from cries of desperation to something cruel, something mocking. It was as if whatever was out there had been waiting for us, drawing us closer, and then, toying with us. "We can't stay here," Helena said, her voice growing more frantic. "We should leave. Tonight." The thought of leaving crossed my mind too, but it wasn't that simple. The nearest village was miles away, and the fog had already started to roll in again, thick and impenetrable. The roads would be impossible to navigate in the dark, especially with the woods lurking on either side. "Let's wait until morning," I said, trying to sound calm, though my heart was still racing. "We'll pack up and go at first light, but it's too dangerous to leave right now." Helena didn't like it, but she nodded. "Okay, first thing in the morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're getting out of here." I wished I could believe that morning would make a difference. But deep down, I knew that whatever had found us in the forest wasn't bound by day or night. It had come to us, and I had the sinking feeling that it wasn't going to let us leave so easily. That night, we barricaded ourselves in the bedroom, locking the door and leaving the light on. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside had us both sitting up, eyes wide, waiting for the next sound, the next cry, the next laugh. And sure enough, just before dawn, we heard it again, but this time it wasn't coming from the woods. It was right outside the cabin. The next morning came like a lifeline. The sunlight creeping through the cracks in the cabin felt almost unreal, as if we had somehow crossed into a different world overnight. But I knew better. The terror of the night before hadn't faded with the arrival of day. It just lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the shadows to return. Helena was already awake, pacing the small kitchen with dark circles under her eyes. She looked as tired as I felt. Neither of us had slept, not really. The sound of that laughter outside the cabin had kept us up, hearts pounding as we waited for something, anything, to happen. But after that last burst of mocking, it had gone quiet again. Too quiet. "We're leaving today, right?" Helena asked, her voice shaky but determined. I nodded, though a knot of anxiety sat heavy in my stomach. "We'll pack up, get to the car, and drive to the village. I'll call someone about the cabin later. We'll figure out what to do from there." Helena didn't need convincing. She was already pulling clothes from drawers, stuffing them haphazardly into a bag. I followed suit, though I kept glancing out the window. The woods looked deceptively calm in the daylight, but I could feel the weight of them pressing down on the cabin. Whatever had been out there last night hadn't gone. It was just waiting. I tried to shake the thought off, focusing on getting everything ready for our hasty departure, but my mind kept circling back to that laughter. It hadn't been the sound of something human. It wasn't just the tone of it. It was the way it seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself had been laughing at us, taunting us. As we packed, I noticed Helena sitting at the small kitchen table, flipping through an old book she must have found in the cabin's single bookshelf. Her hands were trembling as she scanned the pages. "Helena, we don't have time." "I think I found something," she interrupted, her voice a whisper. "About what we heard." I walked over and glanced at the book. It was an old, worn volume, the pages yellowed with age, the cover barely legible. Folk tales and legends of the Swedish North. "What is it?" I asked, leaning over her shoulder. She turned the book around, showing me a page. There, in faded print, was a story about something called the Myling. "Mylings," she read aloud, her voice tight, "are the spirits of children who were abandoned in the wilderness or buried alive by their parents. They are doomed to wander, crying out for someone to give them rest. The legend says they seek revenge on the living, drawing them into the woods where they were left to die." I stared at the page, my throat tightening. The words hit like a punch to the gut. It couldn't be. I had heard of Myling legends before, stories told by superstitious villagers, but I had never believed them. They were just folklore, ghost stories to keep children from wandering into the woods at night. But the sound we had heard, the crying, the laughter, it fit. The thought of those abandoned children, wandering the woods, seeking some form of justice or vengeance, made my skin crawl. Helena's voice trembled as she read further. It says they sometimes call out in the night, mimicking the cries of a child to lure people deeper into the forest. Once close enough, the Myling climbs onto their back, growing heavier with each step until the person is crushed under the weight. I shuddered. The image of a child's ghost clinging to my back, growing heavier and heavier until it suffocated me, flashing in my mind. "That's insane," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I didn't believe them. Not anymore. Helena closed the book and stood up, her face pale. "We're leaving, right now." We rushed to finish packing, moving as fast as we could without speaking. I grabbed the car keys and stuffed them into my pocket, my heart pounding faster with every second. The weight of the Myling legend sat heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. We stepped outside, the cold air biting at our skin as we crossed the yard to the car. I glanced toward the woods, half expecting to see something moving between the trees, but the forest was still, eerily still. Helena climbed into the passenger seat while I threw the last of the bags into the trunk. The engine roared to life, and I felt a brief surge of relief. We were leaving. We would get out of here, and whatever had been haunting us would be left behind. But as I pulled out onto the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be that easy. The Myling didn't just want us gone. It wanted more, and I wasn't sure we could outrun it. We drove for what felt like hours, though in reality, the village wasn't more than 30 minutes away. The winding forest roads stretched endlessly ahead, framed by the looming pines that seemed to bend closer with each passing mile. The trees cast long, jagged shadows across the dirt road, and even though it was the middle of the day, everything felt muted, like we were driving through a twilight that wasn't ready to end. Helena sat beside me in silence, her face turned toward the window, staring blankly at the passing trees. I knew she was still thinking about the Myling, the legend we'd read about just hours before. And truthfully, so was I. The word itself lingered in my mind like a curse, something old and heavy that we'd accidentally brought to life by learning its name. Myling. It sounded harmless enough, but the weight of it was suffocating. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. We were almost out, almost safe. That's what I kept telling myself, but the forest didn't seem to agree. The further we drove, the thicker the trees became, closing in on the road like an old, gnarled cage. I could still hear the wind howling through the branches. But there was something else, too. A sound just beneath the surface of the wind. So faint, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I didn't dare mention it to Helena, but the sound of a child crying still clung to the back of my mind, like an echo that hadn't quite died out. "We should have left sooner," Helena said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of her fear. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were still fixed on the trees, as if she expected something to leap out from the shadows at any moment. "I know," I muttered, though the words felt hollow. There wasn't much comfort in them. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, urging the car forward. The trees blurred together as we picked up speed, but the unease sitting in my chest didn't lessen. If anything, it grew stronger. That's when the engine sputtered. I froze. The car lurched, jerking forward as if it had hit something. I eased off the gas, my heart pounding. The engine stuttered again, the sound jagged and unnatural. I glanced at the dashboard. Everything looked fine. No warning lights, no overheating, just the steady tick of the gas meter slowly dropping as we pushed further down the road. But the car was struggling, and we both knew it. "Come on," I muttered, trying to will the car to keep going. We were close. We had to be close, but the engine wasn't listening. It coughed again. Then the whole car shook, the steering wheel vibrating under my hands. "Something's wrong," Helena said, her voice trembling. She sat up straighter, her eyes flicking nervously between me and the dashboard. "It's not supposed to do that, right?" "No," I said, my voice tight. "It's not." The car shuddered again, this time more violently, and then, with a sickening lurch, the engine cut out completely. The car coasted forward for a few more feet, then slowed to a stop in the middle of the road. We sat there in stunned silence, the only sound the wind rattling the branches overhead. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, the fear climbing up my throat. I turned the key in the ignition, praying for the engine to roar back to life, but all I got was a hollow clicking sound. "Are you kidding me?" I growled, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. I tried again and again, but the engine was dead. "We're stuck," Helena whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the panic building behind them. "We can't be stuck. Not here." She didn't need to say it. I knew exactly what she was thinking. We were in the middle of the forest, miles from the village, and the sun was already starting to dip lower in the sky. The shadows were growing longer, the light slipping away from us as if it couldn't stand to be here any longer. And then I heard it. Faint at first, just a whisper carried on the wind, but as the silence stretched, it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of crying, high-pitched, mournful, desperate. The kind of cry that chilled you to the bone. The kind of cry we had heard before. Helena's breath hitched, and she gripped the seat beneath her. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. The sound was getting closer, louder. And this time, I couldn't pretend it was my imagination. I couldn't pretend it was anything other than what it was. The Myling had followed us. I turned to Helena, my voice shaking as I said, "We need to run." For a second, neither of us moved. We just sat there, staring out at the darkening forest, listening to the sound of the crying as it drew closer, creeping in from all directions. It wasn't just a child's cry anymore. It was something darker, something more insistent. It felt like a cold hand wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Helena turned to me, her face pale and her eyes wide. "We can't run," she whispered. "We don't even know where it's coming from." She was right, of course. The sound seemed to be everywhere, swirling through the trees, bouncing off the trunks like it was being carried by the wind. There was no direction to it, no way to know where to go or where not to go. But staying in the car, stranded in the middle of this forest, with the Myling's cries growing louder, wasn't an option. "We can't stay here either," I said, my voice rough. "If we don't leave now, we'll be sitting ducks." Helena nodded, though I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to move. Neither did I, really. But the longer we waited, the more suffocating the sound became. It wasn't just crying anymore. It was a wail, filled with anger, frustration, and something else. Something hungry. I grabbed my coat from the back seat and tossed Helena hers. We moved quickly, grabbing our bags, stuffing a few essentials into them, as if this was just a temporary inconvenience, as if we could outrun what was already circling us. I shoved the car keys into my pocket, a useless gesture, but somehow holding on to them felt like I was clinging to some sense of control. As soon as we stepped out of the car, the cold hit us like a slap. The forest felt different now, darker, even though the last traces of daylight still lingered above the treetops. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisted and gnarled, forming an impenetrable canopy above us. The path ahead was little more than a dirt road, flanked by shadows that felt alive. The crying was louder now, louder than I'd ever heard it before. It was no longer distant. It was close, too close, as if the Myling was standing just a few feet away, hidden by the trees, waiting for us to make our move. The sound had shifted, no longer simply mournful, but laced with a seething kind of rage, a demand. It wasn't crying for help, it was crying for us. "We need to stick together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't stop. Don't turn back." Helena nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see her hands shaking, clutching her coat like a lifeline, but she didn't protest. We started walking down the road, our footsteps crunching on the gravel, the sound almost drowned out by the wailing that seemed to echo through the very air around us. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and making the trees sway ominously. Every snap of a branch made us flinch. Every gust of wind seemed to carry that terrible sound closer, as though the Myling was stalking us, following just beyond our sight. We moved faster. "Where do we go?" Helena asked, her voice barely steady. She glanced around frantically, as though expecting to see something leap out from the shadows at any moment. "Just keep heading toward the village," I said, though I didn't know if we'd make it there. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the road twisting and turning, narrowing as we went. It felt like we were being funneled, driven toward something we couldn't see. Suddenly, the wailing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound. It was thick, suffocating, as though the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Helena stopped walking, turning to look at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Why did it stop?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was pounding in my chest, my skin prickling with cold sweat. The road ahead was empty, nothing but trees and shadows, but I knew we weren't alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the crying began again. This time, it was right behind us. Helena let out a choked gasp, and I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on nothing but empty road. But the sound, God, the sound was so close I could feel it in my bones, vibrating through the air. I grabbed Helena's hand, pulling her forward. "Run," I said, my voice hoarse. "Just run." We took off down the road, our feet pounding against the dirt, the crying chasing us, closer and closer with every step. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I knew the Myling was right there, its cold, furious presence breathing down our necks. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how fast we ran, it wasn't going to let us go. We ran blindly, our footsteps pounding against the dirt road, the sound of our ragged breaths merging with the wind that howled through the trees. The darkness seemed to close in around us, swallowing the faint moonlight that trickled through the canopy above. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. The Myling's presence trailing just behind us, its cries growing louder, more desperate, as if it knew we were trying to escape. "Keep going," I yelled, though I could barely hear my own voice over the wind and the cries that seemed to come from all directions. Helena's hand was cold and clammy in mine, and I could feel her starting to slow, her steps growing heavy and uneven. "I can't," she gasped, stumbling as we rounded a bend in the road. I can't breathe." "We have to keep moving," I insisted, even though my own legs were burning and every breath felt like fire in my lungs. There was no time to stop, no time to rest. I tightened my grip on her hand and pulled her forward, my eyes darting around wildly, searching for anything that might lead us out of this nightmare. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Hadn't we passed that same bent tree just a minute ago? And that pile of rocks? Wasn't it the same one we'd stumbled over when we first started running? It was as if the forest itself was playing tricks on us, keeping us trapped in this endless loop with no way out. Then, just as I thought my legs would give out, we stumbled into a small clearing. The ground was softer here, covered in a thick layer of moss that muffled our footsteps. In the center stood an ancient-looking stone well, its surface slick with moisture and tangled vines creeping up from the base. It looked out of place, as if it had been there long before the forest had grown around it, a remnant of some forgotten time. "Stop," Helena whispered, her voice barely more than a ragged breath. Just stop." We came to a halt, both of us gasping for air. The cries had stopped again, but this time the silence was even more unsettling. I felt my skin prickle with the realization that the Myling was nearby, watching us, waiting for us to let our guard down. "Why did it stop?" Helena asked, her eyes darting nervously toward the well. "Why isn't it?" But before she could finish, a soft whimper cut through the silence, and we both turned toward the well. There, in the faint light, I saw it. A small figure, barely visible, crouched by the edge. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. Its body was thin and pale, its hair matted with dirt, and its face was twisted in an expression of such pain and sorrow that it sent a shiver down my spine. The Myling. Helena took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The Myling just stared at us, its eyes hollow and dark, like bottomless pits that seemed to draw in all the light around them. And then it moved. Slowly, it stood up, its frail body trembling as it pointed a bony finger toward us. The air grew colder, and I felt an overwhelming pressure settle over my chest, as if the weight of the entire forest had descended upon us. We have to help it," Helena said suddenly, her voice trembling. "That's what it wants, isn't it? It's looking for peace." I wanted to argue, to tell her that there was nothing we could do, that we needed to run and never look back. But something about the way the Myling stared at us, the way its mouth trembled as if it were trying to speak, made me hesitate. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you following us?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice that sounded like the wind rustling through dead leaves, the Myling spoke. "Carry me." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I took a step back. "What do you mean?" I stammered, but the Myling only pointed again, its dark eyes boring into mine. "Carry me," it repeated, its voice growing fainter, weaker. "Helena?" Helena looked at me, her eyes shining with tears. "It wants us to help it find peace. It was abandoned. We have to finish what wasn't done." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's dangerous, Helena. We don't know what it'll do." "We can't just leave it," she insisted. "We can't." Before I could stop her, Helena took a step forward, reaching out her hand. "It's okay," she whispered to the Myling. "We'll carry you." The Myling moved forward, and as it did, I saw it clearly for the first time. Its small, emaciated body, the bones protruding from under its skin, the hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. It reached up, and Helena bent down, lifting it into her arms. For a moment, the air seemed to still, the wind dying down, the cold lifting ever so slightly. But then, the weight of the Myling grew heavier. I watched in horror as Helena's knees buckled, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She tried to stand, to keep moving, but it was too much. The Myling clung to her, its thin arms wrapping around her neck, dragging her down. "Help me," Helena choked, her voice strained with panic. "It's too heavy." I reached out, grabbing her arm, trying to pull her away, but the Myling wouldn't let go. It clung to her, its fingers digging into her skin, its weight growing and growing until it forced her to the ground. I watched helpless as the Myling's cries returned, louder than ever, echoing through the clearing as it dragged Helena down, deeper and deeper into the moss-covered earth. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were gone. For a long, paralyzing moment, I just stood there, staring at the spot where Helena had vanished. My brain refused to process what had just happened. 1 second she was there, alive, breathing, pleading for help, and then she was gone. The earth where she'd been swallowed was disturbingly calm, as if nothing had disturbed it, like the forest had simply opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. The Myling's cries echoed through the trees, a sound so piercing and full of anguish it felt like nails driving into my skull. It wasn't just the sorrow or desperation anymore. It was triumph. The Myling had taken what it wanted, what it needed, someone to carry it, to share its unbearable weight, but it hadn't been enough. I could still feel it, lurking, waiting. The cries had shifted, quieter now but still sharp, cutting through the air like shattered glass. I wanted to move, to scream, to dig through the earth with my bare hands and pull Helena out. But I couldn't. My legs felt rooted to the spot, frozen by fear and the sheer horror of what had happened. My hands trembled as I clutched at the flashlight, the dim beam trembling over the moss-covered ground that had swallowed her. "Helena," I whispered, my voice a fragile thing that barely carried through the clearing. The only response was the wind, cold and biting, rattling through the trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I took a shaky step forward, then another, my knees weak, my body trembling. The cries had stopped, but the silence they left behind was worse. The forest had returned to that eerie stillness, the kind that felt more alive than any noise, like it was watching, waiting. I crouched down, my hands shaking as I reached toward the ground, the place where she disappeared. I wasn't even sure what I thought I could do. My fingers dug into the damp moss, clawing at the dirt, the cold seeping into my bones as I scraped at the earth. Nothing, no trace of her. Panic bubbled up inside me, a tight knot in my throat that threatened to choke me. "Helena!" I shouted this time, my voice cracking. "Helena!" The forest swallowed my scream. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. A low rumble vibrated through the earth, like something was stirring just beneath the surface. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the moss began to pull away, peeling back like a scab. The dirt trembled, then burst open, and there, rising from the earth, was the Myling. But this time, it wasn't small. It wasn't fragile. It stood taller now, its gaunt body stretching unnaturally, its bones twisting under its pale skin. Its eyes, those hollow, empty sockets, locked onto me, filled with something far worse than sorrow. There was anger in those empty eyes. Rage. It had taken Helena, and it wasn't finished. It wanted more. I scrambled backward, my hands slipping in the dirt as I tried to push myself to my feet. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through me like fire. The Myling took a step forward, its feet dragging across the ground with a sickening scrape. The weight of it, the sheer presence of it, was overwhelming, suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the clearing, leaving nothing but the Myling's endless, oppressive pull. It was coming for me. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew it wouldn't listen. My voice was hoarse, shaking with fear, but the Myling didn't stop. It moved with deliberate, unnatural slowness, its thin arms outstretched, reaching for me. I turned and ran. I don't remember much about that sprint through the forest. It was all a blur, branches whipping at my face, the sound of my own heartbeat deafening in my ears, my breath ragged as I pushed myself harder than I ever had. I could hear the Myling behind me, its cries growing louder, closer, as it tore through the woods like a storm. The road appeared suddenly, almost out of nowhere, and I stumbled onto it, nearly collapsing from the sheer exhaustion that weighed down my limbs. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I kept running, kept moving, not daring to look back. And then, as quickly as it had come, the sound stopped. I slowed, gasping for breath, my body trembling as I glanced over my shoulder. The road behind me was empty, the forest dark and still. The Myling was gone, or at least it wasn't following anymore. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the trees, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing did. The cries had vanished, swallowed by the silence of the woods. Helena was gone. I knew that, even as my mind tried to reject it. The Myling had taken her, and it had let me go. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it had gotten what it wanted. Maybe it was saving me for later. All I knew was that the weight of what had happened would stay with me forever. The Myling wasn't done. Not yet. And deep down, I knew one terrible truth. I would never escape the forest.